Ottawa imposed an export ban on potatoes from the island to the U.S. That was back in November.
Tonight, many of America's farmers already feeling the pinch are worried about the possibility of more challenges.
Very significant market, long-term relationships there. Anything that would impact that is obviously of huge concern.
What if I told you the next chapter in North America's trade tensions didn't start with oil or steel or semiconductors? It started with French fries. Not headlines, not emergency speeches, not dramatic summits, just a quiet shift inside refrigerated warehouses in Prince Edward Island, Alberta, and Manitoba. And if you think this is just about fast food, stay with me, because this is really about leverage, sovereignty, and who controls the supply chain that feeds America. Imagine this: you pull into a drive-thru, you order a combo, and the cashier says, "Fries are unavailable." Not because of a storm, not because of a strike, but because 1.2 million tons of frozen potatoes no longer move automatically across a border. Every year, the United States imports roughly 1.4 million tons of frozen French fries. About 86% of those imports come from Canada. That's not a backup supplier, that's dependency. For decades, this worked smoothly. Canadian farmers grew the potatoes. Canadian processors cut and froze them. Trucks crossed south, chains like McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's fried them. No one noticed, because the most powerful supply chains are the ones that feel invisible, until someone politicizes them. According to trade discussions circulating in policy circles, former U.S. President Donald Trump pushed the idea that American food security justified guaranteed priority access to Canadian agricultural exports, including frozen potatoes. The framing was strategic necessity, integrated economies, shared supply chains, neighborly obligation. But here's the critical difference between trade and entitlement. Trade is negotiated, entitlement is assumed. And that's where the shift happened. Canada's response wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical, but it was firm. Canadian agriculture serves Canadian priorities first, not anti-American, not hostile, just sovereign. Now, here's where this gets interesting, and this is the part most commentary misses. Trump looked at the numbers and saw leverage. If 90% of Canadian frozen fry exports go to the US, that's pressure power. But Canadian policymakers looked at the same numbers and saw vulnerability. If 90% of your exports go to one buyer, and that buyer is willing to threaten tariffs, you're exposed. So instead of banning exports, Canada diversified, quietly. Delegations traveled across Southeast Asia. Negotiations accelerated with Indonesia. Discussions deepened with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Japan expanded purchases. Mexico increased imports. European distributors opened new channels. Here's the strategic masterstroke. Canada didn't cut America off. It just stopped treating America as automatic. And the moment a guaranteed buyer becomes just another customer, leverage shifts. Let's zoom out. This isn't the first time this pattern has appeared. Oil, lumber, steel, critical minerals. American industries built business models around Canadian supply. It made sense. Geography favors efficiency. Pipelines run south. Rail lines cross borders. Markets integrated. But once trade becomes a political weapon, integration becomes exposure. And exposure forces adaptation. With oil, Canada expanded Pacific export capacity. With minerals, domestic processing grew. With lumber, new European buyers strengthened. Potatoes are simply the most visible example because you and I can taste the impact. You don't see crude shipments, you don't track rare earth exports, but you notice when fries shrink. Now let's talk about power. Supply chain leverage belongs to whoever controls the bottleneck. In frozen fries, the bottleneck isn't just farmland, it's processing capacity, industrial scale freezing facilities, distribution logistics, established agricultural networks. Those aren't built overnight. You can't simply grow more Idaho potatoes and instantly replace 1.2 million tons of integrated supply. Scaling agriculture takes seasons. Building processing plants takes years. Rewriting contracts takes time, which means short-term disruption favors the supplier. And here's the paradox of weaponized trade. The moment you threaten a supplier, you incentivize them to find other buyers. Once they find other buyers, your threats lose force. It's a self-eroding strategy. Now let's imagine escalation. If tariffs hit Canadian frozen fries, costs rise for American chains. Menu prices increase, portions adjust, franchise owners absorb thinner margins, consumers notice, and when consumers notice, politics follows. But here's the deeper geopolitical shift that makes this moment bigger than fries. If food security can justify guaranteed access to Canadian potatoes, could energy security justify guaranteed access to Canadian oil? If agricultural integration implies obligation, does mineral integration imply the same? That's the slippery slope Canada is trying to avoid. Because once resources are framed as shared assets rather than sovereign exports, the negotiating table changes shape, and sovereignty is rarely surrendered quietly. This is why diversification matters. Every contract signed in Southeast Asia reduces automatic dependence on the US market. Every European distributor agreement lowers vulnerability. Every expanded Asian shipment becomes insurance against future tariffs. Insurance changes psychology. A supplier with one buyer negotiates cautiously. A supplier with 5 buyers negotiates confidently. Confidence changes outcomes. Now let's address something critical. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner. The relationship is deeply integrated. Neither side benefits from prolonged disruption. But integration is not ownership. And that's the lesson unfolding here. For decades, proximity created assumption. Assumption created complacency. Complacency created leverage imbalance. That imbalance is being recalibrated. Not through confrontation, through optionality. Optionality is power. And once optionality exists, it doesn't disappear easily. Think about what this means long term. If even 25% of Canadian frozen fry exports permanently shift toward Asia and Europe, US buyers lose structural leverage. The supply chain becomes competitive instead of preferential. That dynamic could extend to other sectors, energy flows, mineral refinement, agricultural trade more broadly. This isn't de-globalization, it's rebalancing. Now let's bring this back to something tangible. When you see a fast food chain quietly adjust pricing or portions, it may look trivial. But behind that small change could be a diplomatic disagreement, a trade negotiation, a sovereignty dispute, a supply chain recalibration. That's how modern geopolitics works. It doesn't always explode. Sometimes it shifts, silently, strategically, one contract at a time. And here's the ultimate irony. The more aggressively trade is weaponized, the faster suppliers diversify. The faster suppliers diversify, the weaker weaponized trade becomes, which means the strongest leverage strategy in the short term can destroy leverage in the long term. That's the lesson oil taught. That's the lesson minerals are teaching. And now that's the lesson potatoes are demonstrating. This isn't about anti-American policy. It isn't about anti-Canadian sentiment. It's about a universal economic rule. Control of supply equals negotiating power. And suppliers who discover they have alternatives rarely return to dependence. So the next time someone says, it's just fries, remember, global power rarely announces itself dramatically. Sometimes it's hidden in something ordinary. Sometimes it's sitting in a freezer warehouse. Sometimes it's moving across a border or not. And sometimes it reshapes leverage between two nations without a single headline declaring a trade war. Because in today's world, sovereignty isn't only defended with armies, it's defended with supply chains. And in this case, it's defended one shipment at a time. If you found this analysis valuable, stay with this channel, because the next major geopolitical shift probably won't begin with missiles or markets crashing. It might begin with something far more ordinary, something you order every week and don't think twice about.